anything, as I mentioned earlier, of a skeptic saying that, oh, the Gospels were written very late, it's just bad scholarship. It's not in line with science. It's not in line with archaeology. None of that's true. It's just lies, empty lies. So keep that in mind. All right, guys, today we are jumping into the introduction of the book of Mark, or the Gospel according to Mark, as it's been passed down to us. And there is so much information that we're going to be unpacking today. But just to list off a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about in this video, we're going to talk about the purpose behind the writing of Mark. We're going to talk about the theme of Mark, or what to expect with the book of Mark. Also, we're going to, of course, talk about the authorship of Mark, which is really interesting and helpful. Next, we'll talk about the dating of Mark and some of the challenges in that, but I think we have a lot of reason to be thankful and to be thoroughly convinced in our minds that this was given to us very early. Last, we're going to look at the accounting of the early church fathers, including Papias, Clement, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian, and Augustine. There may be one or two more, but we may not mention all of these guys, but all of these guys and maybe some more attest to Mark's authorship of this book and Peter's influence of this book. And we'll pull out a few of those and look at it on the timeline. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the fragments at Qumran that's pretty interesting for this topic. So without further ado, the purpose of Mark, it is to record Peter's account and memoir of the gospel. We get this from one of the early church fathers, where he speaks of Peter being the fountain, if you will, or the mouth, which Mark records theologically, how he's influenced to record that of Peter's preaching. And that has been the tradition that's accepted throughout the first few hundred years of church history, is that Peter was the prime influencer of this work, and that John Mark, recorded this and wrote it down so that the apostolic preaching would be preserved. And so while we cannot specifically date this, and we'll get to this later in this video, it seems that this was written down later on in Peter's ministry in Rome. And there may be a couple reasons for this. And like I said, there's debate on when exactly this was written. But what we can know is that all the apostles died martyrs' deaths. And so with the looming reality that at any given moment these apostles could be put to death, or also the reality of their aging and getting older, the recording of their account or their memoir was really important. And so while John Mark was not an eyewitness to Jesus Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, he was recording for Peter, who was there in part. And so he's trying to preserve the faithful interpretation of these events, which took place historically according to, namely, Peter, for Mark. And there's a couple reasons how we can know this is specific to Peter within the Bible itself, outside of church history, but I think church history is a very, very helpful source for this. And so one of the things I wanted to mention is that so often you'll hear, if you're like me, I'm always learning, I'm always listening to debates, and you'll hear skeptics often cast doubt on the authenticity of the Gospels. You'll hear skeptics and atheists and unbelievers cast doubt on all these things. And there's really more evidence truly for the Bible than any other book in history to its authenticity. There's more documented evidence for the New Testament, for the Gospels, than any other historical work known to mankind. So keep that in mind. And there's such a wealth of knowledge and information concerning these things. So don't let that casting of doubt on your mind really stay there for long, because really what it is, it's people with ulterior motives, it's people that have agendas, and it's people that are not afraid or unwilling to lie. And if they're not lying, they're speaking out of ignorance, which in itself is wrong. So keep all that in mind. Just because someone's skeptical doesn't mean they're going to tell you the truth. They may have ulterior motives. And like I said, there is such a wealth of information to the genuineness of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, as we'll be talking about today. So this was written for the purpose of preserving Peter's account as, he was to die soon or die eventually. And it seems that this was written somewhere, we'll get into this later, but some say it was slightly before his death, some say it was slightly after his death. I think it was probably written before his death, and I think it was written with the approval of Mark and the approval of Peter together, but we'll talk about that. And so next thing I want to mention is the theme of this book. So we talked a little bit about the purpose. Of course, this is an extremely valuable text. This gospel was passed around the early church and written down and rewritten down, faithfully translated throughout all the churches. This was a very important text, and it's taught that in the early church they mainly taught from the Old Testament scriptures and the Gospels. Of course, Paul's letters come into play later on, but at the very beginning, these were the essential writings. And so John the Baptist to Jesus' ascension, this is what, in an essential, I would call this, I'm from North Carolina, so we'll call Mark the meat and potatoes of the gospel. If you're not from North Carolina, what I'm basically saying is that Mark is the shortest gospel, and Mark leaves out a lot of details. The purpose of Mark is mainly for recording from the time of John the Baptist, where he starts his ministry, lasts for 6 months, and then he's beheaded. And immediately after John the Baptist is thrown in jail, Jesus picks up that ministry as the Messiah, which lasts around 3 years before he's crucified. Mark is from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 16, just an account of some of the major events, trying to prove the divinity of Christ. I believe in the first 8 chapters. In the last half, those last 8 chapters is speaking to the passion of the Christ. Also, I just wanted to mention in this introduction, there is within critical scholarship of the New Testament, there's really 2 major texts that seem to have been added to the Bible. This is common knowledge in scholarship, but sadly it's not common knowledge amongst Christians. And so one of these texts is the alternate ending to the book of Mark. And this was added probably, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but this was added probably around the end of the 1st century or beginning of the 2nd century. But we do know that it was not recorded by John Mark or Mark who wrote this gospel. So it doesn't cause any doctrinal problems for us, but it is a later addition. And so this is, of course, the snake handling passage, if you're familiar with this. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I just wanted to mention that. The other, if you're unaware, is the woman who was caught in adultery. That story was inserted as well into the gospel accounts at a later time. And so I think these have truths, and I think they're true stories, but we might want to strongly consider keeping them out of our Bibles because they weren't genuinely written by who they say they were. This was an alteration and adding to the text. So again, there's a date in the 60s, which is very common. And then the other thing, these 2 are very interesting. As I already mentioned, the extended ending of Gospel of Mark, which is the first half of the 2nd century was when this was added. So let's talk about this really briefly. So if you look at this, it's Mark chapter 16, verse 9 through 20. And usually what you'll see, if you can look on the screen, this will be in brackets usually. There's also the famous Bible verse where the angel is said to have come to stir up the waters before Jesus heals someone, and it's kind of like a commentary, an explanatory note as to why Jesus went to this pool at Bethesda to heal. So keep that in mind. This is a later addition. It seems to be clear that this was added based on some different evidences, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. This would be a whole separate video, but I just wanted to bring some attention to that. So concerning the date of the book of Mark, there is a plethora of, or a huge amount of scholarship, especially conservative evangelical scholarship, that would locate the Gospel of Mark in the early 60s AD. So that's a very likely date. But I also wanted to mention this scroll manuscript from Qumran. It's very, very interesting. So we see here 50 to 68 AD. We have Qumran manuscript 7Q5, possibly containing text from the Gospel of Mark when that was written. And so when you see 7Q5, what we know is that there's 11 caves at Qumran, which I've had the great honor of going there myself. But at Qumran, there's 11 caves that were uncovered in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, in which they uncovered papyri that date all the way back to the time of Christ, even preceding the time of Christ. And with the unique climate there, those things could be preserved throughout history. So 2,000-year-old papyri, which usually only lasts about 100 years. Like I said, due to the climate, it's just cool how God did that. But those things are being continually pieced together and interpreted and recorded. They're actually, majority of them are online. You can access them. And so I just wanted to show you this passage. Like I said, this is 7Q5, and I'll take you to the infallible Wikipedia. So 7Q5, just to make a quick mention of this, like I said, from the way we read it, the seventh cave, and I'm not exactly sure how they, it's fragment number 5. I'm not exactly sure how they prioritize those or number them. It may be in order. I'm not 100% sure, but I do know it's the Q5 or fragment 5 from the seventh cave. So this one, which is really interesting, it dates back to somewhere between 50 BC and 50 AD, or as they say, BCE and CE. It dates somewhere back there. And what's interesting about this is, if you see it right here, they've tried to reconstruct this to show which parts are in the gospel according to Mark. And so if you see here in the red, this is what we can see in the fragment here in the picture. Or you can also see in the bold here in English. This is in, of course, the Greek. So this is very interesting. So this is some evidence. There's scholars, as with every single issue in under the sun, there's scholars on both sides of this issue. Shocker there. But some say that it's not possible, that it's speaking that text, or rather I should say they would say it's unclear as to if this is that text. And others would say that it's very, very, very possibly this text. Anyways, there's a picture of Qumran and those caves where those scrolls were stored. Matter of fact, I just remembered I actually got a souvenir when I got to go to Israel. If you can see this, they actually have replicas of the Qumran clay jars where the Qumran scrolls were stored. So I just want to get this out and show it really quick. So if you're like me, when you originally have read this, maybe you've never even heard of any of this, but when I originally heard of the Qumran scrolls found in jars, I thought they were huge, huge jars. And this, if you look at it in comparison to my head, is a very, very tiny jar. If you look here, you can see a scroll rolled up in there. And that would be, it's a replica, I believe, of the Isaiah scroll in there. But people wrote really small and was really tiny. So that's what's going on here. So the reason that they were written so small is because, of course, papyri was more expensive. Not like anything like today where paper is very cheap and writing is very cheap and everyone's literate. It was a much different time. But I just want to mention that. So in summary, know that it's somewhere between, as we stated before, somewhere between 50 and really 70 AD is a good time period for when the Gospel of Mark was written. But like I said, the reason I brought up that Qumran fragment is because whatever date it was, there's a strong possibility it was early, and we can't know this. This is 2,000 years, so unless a definitive text is uncovered archaeologically, while we cannot know with specificity the exact day or year maybe that was written, we can know that this was early. This was the time period while the apostles would be alive and while their disciples were alive. So anything, as I mentioned earlier, of a skeptic saying that, the Gospels were written very late, it's just bad scholarship. It's not in line with science. It's not in line with archaeology. None of that's true. It's just lies, empty lies. So keep that in mind. So I wanted to mention that. This gives us, it at least gives me a great comfort and joy to know that the Gospels were recorded. And we know that they were recorded because the apostles were spreading out. We know that they were recorded because of persecution. And we know that as the apostles got older, they were trying to preserve this gospel tradition for the next generation. And so if you may have the question, well, why wasn't it written down immediately? Well, they had the apostles themselves right there to share that testimony. And so writing was less common. So whatever date we land on, all of these, even if it's as late as 70, that's still very, very early. And it could be as early as 40s, which is insanely early. That's only 10 years, less than 10 years removed of the resurrection and ascension of Christ. So this gives me great comfort, peace, and joy. And like I said, this is backed by science, archaeology, history, and many other things. Okay, so I wanted to look together with you at one passage in 1 Peter. And you say, well, Grant, what does 1 Peter have to do with Mark? But according to 1 Peter, according to church tradition, Mark was Peter's interpreter. So Peter most likely had an understanding of the Greek language. As a fisherman, he would have encountered non-Jewish people and would have had to have some level of understanding of the language of Greek. But it doesn't seem, it's at least possible he didn't have a very detailed writing capacity for Greek. And so Mark, based on his writing, the words he chooses, we know that he was very fluent in Greek, very well educated in this. So this is where 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 12 comes in. This is actually something that is repeatedly referenced by the early church fathers as a proof text for their position, for their tradition. But like I said, tradition is unanimous that Mark was someone who is very close to Peter, who is someone that Peter discipled, and we're going to look at those early church fathers in just a moment. But I wanted to show you a text here. This is 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12. He says this, through Silvanus, whom I know to be a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly in order to encourage you and testify that this is the true grace of God. So we see in the writing of this letter of 1 Peter, there's this guy Silvanus involved. It seems like maybe he was the one who was carrying the letter because this is who was going to deliver it. Because he says, through Silvanus, right here in the beginning, and then next, I have written to you briefly. So it seems like he was the one carrying the word, and we'll see here later in this text, in order to encourage you and testify that this is the true grace of God, stand fast in it. The church in Babylon, chosen together with you, most would agree that this is Peter referencing Rome, where this was being written from, and that Peter was referring to Rome as Babylon, which has so much symbolism, but referencing Rome. And then he says, chosen together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. Right? And so it's very possible Peter is dictating this. Mark is over here writing this down, and maybe Silvanus is in the corner or something. I don't know. But this is where we kind of get a proof text outside of tradition, literally in the recorded text. For this is, of course, not Mark. This is 1 Peter. But we know that Mark seems to, according to church history, have been this go-to guy for Peter. So very interesting. For the book of Mark itself, we actually don't have, in the beginning, we don't have a title Mark. This was added later. And we don't at the end have a reference that Mark wrote this. And I think there's good reason why. Because if we think about it, they were recording history. If you pull out an encyclopedia or something like that, a dictionary, usually it doesn't have a single name behind a source for every fact. And the reason for that, the way encyclopedias tend to go this way, is because they're bringing a consensus of fact. They're bringing a consensus of agreement on information. And so in the same way, these Gospels, these guys weren't writing these to sell them. They're not writing these to put their name on it to say this is coming from one person, but rather as hundreds of people saw Jesus ascend into heaven, hundreds of people saw the risen Christ, they're writing this together as a group, as a factual historical document. And so Mark's not writing his name in there trying to get famous. And I don't think this should bother us, but the reason Mark was added later, a few hundred years later, in the 2nd or 3rd century, was because they just wanted to preserve that tradition that was unanimous. It was well known. But as you get further away from that, they wanted to record that so we would know that today. I want to go through some church fathers here. I've listed them earlier, and I'll try to show you as much as I can. Some of it I'll be reading from a book. But the first person I want us to mention is Papias. He was a bishop around 60 AD to 130 AD, and he was the bishop of Hierapolis in Phrygia, which was around where Paul and Timothy were working, the early church was working, in the vicinity of New Testament churches of Colossae, where we get Colossians, and Laodicea, right, which is mentioned in Revelation. And so Papias is the first to affirm, he's the earliest, I should say, in church fathers to affirm this. And so I just want to read from him. This is all recorded by a later church historian, Eusebius. But I'll just read what Papias said. And again, he lived in 60 AD to 130 AD. So this is very near to Christ. But now we must add to the words of Papias, which we have already quoted, the tradition which he gives in regard to Mark, the author of the gospel. So we know the author of John, we know the author of Luke, we know Matthew, and Mark is kind of specific in this uniqueness of Mark is recording Peter's gospel. In the following words, this also John the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him, but afterward, as I said, he was in company with Peter, who used to offer teaching as necessity demanded. And he records to say, but with no intention of connected account of the Lord's discourses. So a few things we can get from Papias, this earliest proponent of this. A few things. Mark interpreted Peter accurately, as recorded. The next, Peter was Mark's chief access to the recollection of Jesus. So this is more so the gospel of Peter than it is the gospel of Mark. Mark did not record the tradition in order. Some of this we can just get by reading the book of Mark. In comparison to the other gospels, we see that it's shorter. It does not have as much information. It's not in a timeline type order, but instead it is scattered throughout. But all of it's factually true. And this was in accordance with how Peter would preach. Also that Peter presented the Lord's teaching as the situation demanded, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses. Like I said, this is specific to what Papias has to say. And lastly, that nothing crucial was distorted or omitted. So while it may be out of order, it may be short, it may just be the meat and potatoes, it is all true gospel information and should be treated as such. The next I wanted to mention is Clement of Alexandria, who lived around 150 AD to 215 AD. What's interesting about him is that he was in Egypt, so this is a good distance removed from where Papias was, And he reconfirms the tradition that Mark was a reliable interpreter of the narrative of the Lord attested by Peter. So just reading Clement, this is where we get the apocryphal books of First Clement, Second Clement. Maybe you've never heard of that. But Clement, he says, again in the same books, this is again from Eusebius, the church historian. Clement gives the tradition of the earliest presbyters as to the order of the Gospels in the following manner. The Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. Okay, so we know that Matthew has a genealogy and that Luke has a genealogy. One traces the father, Joseph, the other traces the mother, Mary. And so Mark does not have a genealogy pointing to Christ. So the Gospels containing the genealogies, he said, were written first. So this is according to Clement. The Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the Gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered well what he had said, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly hindered nor encouraged it. Like I said, there is slight distinction between the early church fathers as to Peter's thoughts on the writing of this. Some say he affirmed it. Some say he was indifferent. We don't really have a clear answer on that. But that's a tiny, tiny, tiny detail in this wealth of accurate historical, factual information. So don't let that stump you. Next, I wanted to mention Irenaeus, he also taught the most ancient guardians of the canonical tradition valued Mark as the disciple and interpreter of Peter, and that he recorded his gospel after Peter's death. Okay, so here's where we start to get some distinction. Some of the church fathers are saying before, some are saying after. This shouldn't affect our faith. This shouldn't make us doubt. There are slightly different traditions, but that's okay. Everyone's unanimous that it was Mark who faithfully followed Peter and was in close relationship with him, and everyone's unanimous that that was going on, that authorship of Mark, and that source of information being from Peter. So Irenaeus, to read him, he says, Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church in Rome. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also transmitted to us in writing those things which Peter had preached. Again, confirming that tradition that Mark was written based on the preaching and teaching of Peter. And so this is where this information came from, not explicitly from Mark. Mark wrote it down and faithfully interpreted it, but it was ultimately from Peter. Origen, who lived 185 AD to 254 AD, also confirms this assumption that Mark reliably wrote according to Peter's gospel, assumed that Mark was the same individual commented by the apostle in 1 Peter 5:13, which we looked at earlier, as my son, right? So as we read in the passage in 1 Peter, Sylvanus is carrying this letter and Mark is writing it down. And this is confirmed with a strong, obviously clear reference in the biblical text, but also with church history seems to point to this as being the reality. And lastly, concerning the early church fathers, I just wanted to read this. I love this. A tradition so widely disseminated as Rome, Palestine, Antioch, Constantinople, Gaul, Phrygia, and Alexandria could hardly have been easily invented or subsequently fabricated, right? This unanimous tradition has come across from all over the map. And so if this was all fabricated, they did a phenomenal job. It's extremely unlikely. The evidence scientifically, archaeologically, historically, it all points to the simple truth of Mark as the recorder of Peter's gospel, and this being faithfully passed down to us. It is unlikely that Clement in Alexandria was relying on Papias and Phrygia, or that Irenaeus in Gaul was relying on Alexandrian tradition. Rather, these traditions were more likely widely separated and perhaps independent traditions reporting the same view of the authorship of Mark as directly dependent on the preaching of Peter. Athanasius wrote, Mark, the gospel writer, uses the same voice as Peter did in his confession of Jesus the Messiah, speaking in harmony with the blessed Peter. So Mark was the hand or pen to Peter's speech. I love this. I think this is very helpful. And lastly, I wanted to mention Jerome, who's a saint according to the Catholic Church, but an important early church father. He says, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, wrote a short gospel at the request of the brethren. It's not mentioned in this book. I believe Jerome was around 300, 400 AD. But anyways, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, wrote a short gospel at the request of the brethren at Rome, embodying what he had heard Peter tell. When Peter had heard this, he approved it and published it to the churches to be read by his authority. As Clement in the 6th book of his Hypotyposis and Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, record, Peter also mentions this Mark in his first epistle, figuratively indicating Rome under the name of Babylon. She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, salutes you, and so does Mark, my son. This is the verse everyone quotes. And like I said, rightly so, this is very strong evidence for John Mark as the recorder of Peter's gospel. What's unique about Jerome, I just will mention, is that he not only accepted the early tradition that Mark was Peter's disciple and interpreter, but further argued beyond Clement that Peter had inspected and approved Mark's report, and that Mark took Peter's gospel to Alexandria and died there as first bishop of Alexandria. Elsewhere, Jerome goes so far as to describe the Mark gospel essentially to Peter, which I would as well, quite frankly. So not that we should change its name, but essentially this is Peter's gospel to us. As I said earlier, and this has been up as I've been reading from the different early church fathers, church tradition identifies John Mark as the author of the second gospel. The text of this gospel does not state the name of its author. The attribution to Mark likely was added in the late 1st or early 2nd century. So still very early adding of the date of Mark. And like I said, this was probably wholly unnecessary because when it was first passed down, it was literally handed off by an associate of Mark, associate of Peter. Everyone knew this. And it was written in later in the 1st century, 2nd century for everyone else and future generations. Also, one of the things I wanted to mention of the many things I've spoken of in this video, this is from Eusebius, a church father early on. I just wanted to record what he had to say about Papias, which again lived in the beginning of 60 AD, was when he was born, so very, very, very early. He says, Papias gives us, you may not be able to read this. Let's see if I can help you guys out. There we go. Papias gives also in his own work other accounts of the words of the Lord on the authority of Ariston, who is mentioned above, and traditions as handed down by the presbyter John, to which we refer those who are fond of learning. But now we must add to the words of his, which we have already quoted, the tradition which he gives in regard to Mark, the author of the gospel. So remember, if we read the book of Mark, the gospel according to Mark, there's no attribution to Mark. It wasn't called the Gospel of Mark. It was just a historical document recording. This was added later. In the following words, this also the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teachings to the need of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account to the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful to say one thing, not to omit any of these things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. And so, again, this is a clear reference to what we find in Mark. We find that it's not written chronologically. We find that it's kind of scattered stories. We find that it's really short, but we find that it's all true and it's all verified in the other Gospels. And so this was Peter's accounting. I also wanted to mention a few things that we can find within the text outside of the book of 1 Peter that point us to the truthfulness of this tradition. What we find within the text of the book of Mark, which I'm going to strongly encourage you, if you watch this whole series chapter by chapter, I'm going to strongly encourage, as you're listening to these 16 chapters, that you watch for these, you look for these. So Peter is mentioned more frequently in the Gospel according to Mark than he is in any of the other Gospels. If my memory serves me correct, he is mentioned 26 times in the Gospel of Mark, compared to others where he may be mentioned 2 or 3 times. So we see this is Peter, Peter, Peter. And the reason for that is because this is Peter's memoir. This is his account of the gospel tradition. The next thing that I want you to look for is that in the Gospel according to Mark, what we see, which actually it's called an inclusio, and this was a common practice in ancient texts, specifically official documents or historical documents, recording of history, that while there may not be an official title, there may not be an official rendering to someone, they will put in almost like bookends. The beginning of the text and the ending of the text will point to a certain person. And usually this was a way for them to discreetly add someone's name, add the author or influencer as the authority there. So what's interesting with this tradition, what we know from history, when we look at the book of Mark or the Gospel according to Mark, Peter is the first disciple mentioned in this book, and he is the last disciple mentioned in this book. And so this seems to be a clear inclusio, seems to be a clear bookend to this Gospel according to Mark, which again is another of the many, many references we have to this being influenced by Peter, Peter's Gospel. The next that we see in this Gospel of Mark is that Peter is described with familiarity. He's called Simon, and so his real name is used. Also, maybe his mother-in-law is mentioned here. And so there is a familiarity with Peter's life and facts around that is specific to the Gospel of Mark. Again, we already mentioned that Peter was explicitly affirmed as the fountain or source by the early church fathers. Another thing that's very interesting here, and I want to explain this, Peter was actually notorious for, if you've been in Sunday school, Peter messes up. Peter says dumb things. Peter slips up, and he has embarrassing moments with Christ. Even to the point of Jesus at one point telling him to get behind me, Satan. And I would not put that on your Christian resume. And so what's interesting is that the book of Mark actually omits all of these scenarios. And I would read them off, but it's just a long list. But any time in which Peter said something or did something embarrassing, it's omitted. And so depending upon the tradition that is true, we don't know exactly everything there is to know. But it's very possible that John Mark, when he's writing this down, and Peter is this very important, very influential church father, he's trying to be respectful and discreet in the way he explains Peter's account. Maybe Peter was embarrassed and didn't share it all with Mark, or maybe John was just out of respect for him not recording those things because he wanted people to listen to Peter, he wanted people to be respectful of Peter, he wanted people to let Peter carry the weight that he does. And so that's very interesting. Again, points to John Mark and Peter as writing this gospel. Again, Peter's knowledge of the circumstances and his particular perspective is specific to the Gospel of Mark. And we see throughout church history that it's Peter's preaching outline that he used to preach the gospel that is followed rather than a chronological rendering of these events. I think that I've mentioned just about everything. The last thing I did want to cover in this introduction to Mark, since it is so important, Peter, in this gospel, I wanted to mention the ending of his life. I wanted to mention the end of Peter, and without getting too far into it, there is a passage in the Gospels, it's in the book of John, that seems to speak to Jesus himself in his resurrected body, going to Peter as he affirms him on the beach 3 times, affirming that 3-time denial with a 3-time restoration. In that scene, in the book of John, Jesus foretells, it seems to be that Jesus foretells Peter of the way in which he will die. He says, when you're old, when you're young, you went where you wanted to go, and I'm paraphrasing this. He says, but when you're older, you'll go where you do not want to go, and your hands will be stretched out, And we know that his hands were literally stretched out and he was crucified upside down. Tradition tells us because Peter did not feel worthy to be crucified in the exact same way as Jesus. And so there's a prediction of Peter's death early on in the book of John, but also we see in early church history the way in which Peter died. And the reason I bring this up is because it seems that whatever view that is true, whether this was shortly before Peter's death or shortly after Peter's death, that this gospel was recorded directly influenced by Peter with that in mind. And so whether it happened right after his death and John Mark took all that he learned from the many years of following Peter, or whether it happened right in front of Peter, which is very possible. We see that the book of 1 Peter was written right there with Mark in the room. Peter was there. And so whatever the truth, whatever the case, this was connected to his death. So I just wanted to speak on that really briefly. To quote Saint Clement, he says in this letter, he says, there was Peter. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you. There was Peter who was by reason of unrighteous jealousy endured not one nor two, but many labors, and thus having borne his testimony went to his appointed place of glory. And so Peter seems to be giving his final gospel proclamations, his final testimony before many, which sometimes it makes me wonder. I couldn't find anything on this, but it makes me wonder if his final testimony was the memoir, the Gospel according to Mark, or maybe it was just Peter standing in front of a group of people testifying the gospel. But he bears his testimony and then literally is willing to take it to his death. And lastly, mentioning Peter's death, I just wanted to mention this. It's called the Quo Vadis. I hope I said that right, but it's an apocryphal event mentioned in the various versions of the Acts of Peter. So this was way late. This is 2nd or 3rd century. We don't know if this is true, but there is some evidence for that. It says, upon the request of the faithful, Peter, threatened with death, fled Rome. At the city gate, he met Christ, who was traveling to Rome to be crucified again. Maybe some kind of vision or something. Peter then returned to Rome and underwent death. In this event, which established a theological introduction to Peter's death, expression is given to the theology of martyrdom. It emphasizes the legitimacy of fleeing during persecution and Rome's special role, whereupon Christ's order, Peter returned to die. This is a steep church tradition that, Peter was fleeing Rome. This is accounted for in many places, and upon leaving, Christ appeared to him. And this records it as Jesus coming to be crucified again, but maybe in a vision that Peter was to be representative of Christ. So this is very possible and very interesting. Like I said, I can't speak on this with definitive assurance, but I do not rule it out of the realm of possibility. So I just wanted to share that. Hopefully this was a complete and fulfilling and insightful and helpful introduction to the book of Mark. So this is what we have to look forward to ahead. These 16 chapters, this short gospel, but jam-packed with the gospel truth, the gospel story, the life of Christ. And it will start with John the Baptist. We'll unpack that and then go all the way through to the ascension. When we get to the end of Mark, I'll deal with that passage that seems to have been added on later, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. So God bless you. Thanks for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you again.